Good afternoon, everyone. Amanda Carter from AMPC here, and welcome to today's webinar, which is part of the AMPC series of webinars to try and continue to help keep our members updated during our time of COVID where we can't do sort of any face-to-faces. So hope you're enjoying them. If for some reason you're not able to attend the full webinar, or you want to go back or want to share it with your work colleagues, etc., we do actually have an AMPC YouTube channel, and on there we've actually created a playlist that has all the past webinars. So feel free to access those if you like, and if you can't find them, let me know and I will send you through the link to the playlist. So today's webinar is an update from the Department of Agriculture, Water and Environment, and we're lucky enough to have Jason Ollington here to give us the update. Matt O'Brien is unfortunately an apology for today, but I'm sure Jason will be able to guide us through. And if anyone's got any questions at all for Jason, you have a question tab on your toolbar. Please write your questions in the toolbar and we will forward them through to Jason, and hopefully he'll be able to answer them throughout the webinar, or we'll be able to get back to you. So thank you very much, Jason, and I'll hand over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Amanda, and good afternoon, everyone. I sort of had a look at the attendee list, or the potential attendee list, prior to today, and I think I've met nearly everyone at some point over the last couple of years attending. But for those that don't know me, my name's Jason Ollington. Currently, I'm the National Veterinary Technical Manager for the Department of Agriculture, Water and Environment. Specifically in the export meat space. So I work for the meat exports branch, which is part of our exports division. So those that have met me would have probably met me in my former role as one of the 3 field operation managers that we have. So specifically, I was looking after New South Wales, Victoria, and Tasmania. And then about a year ago, I decided just wanted a little bit to do something a little bit different, but stay in the meat. I sort of been in meat for over 20 years now, and I really enjoy it. There's some really good people in this industry, and I like associating with them. But I just wanted a little bit of a change, so I've moved into the National Veterinary Technical Manager role, and I guess to a large extent, my role has now become not so much operational, hands-on, getting out to abattoirs and sort of, looking at issues and processes and trying, conduct audits and all that sort of stuff. I'm more sort of looking now at sort of what we do as a regulatory agency in export establishments, the activities of our vets and our meat inspectors, the activities of the establishments and what we ask in those approved arrangements, and just making sure that it aligns nicely with what we want to see to enable us to issue certification. So it's sort of a role which I'm still sort of finding my feet in a little bit. It's a hell of a lot more office space than what I was previously used to. And I'm sort of stuck back in COVID lockdown, so I've sort of had no choice but to sit in front of a computer screen for most of my time in this year. So, but I am enjoying it. So hopefully I'll get to catch up with a few of you over the next sort of couple of years in this role, but if I don't, then I'm always just a phone call away, and I'm sort of always happy to take phone calls or emails if you're out and about and you're sort of, obviously you're dealing with vets and ATMs and FOMs and you sort of just might want to bounce a few things off some other people. So I'm more than happy to take your calls or your emails. So feel free to do that. So what I want to do today is just really give you a brief update. It's not going to, this won't go for that long, I don't think. But as you sort of, probably gone to some of the AMPC network meetings in the past where we're sort of face to face, and there will always be someone from the department give you sort of a 10 or 15 minute sort of update on just all things sort of regulatory export meat and what's happening in our world. So that's what I plan to do today. Most of it, I guess, is focused in on COVID-19. So I just want to talk to you a little bit about some of the impacts that's had on our sort of regulatory sort of systems and what the way that we've tried to manage that. I'll just very briefly touch on some of the meat notices that we've issued, and there's not many this year. I think we've only got 3. Also, just touch on where we're at with the post-mortem inspection and disposition review. And again, there's not a hell of a lot to talk about around that, but I'll just bring you up to speed with where that's at. I want to just touch on the export rules. We've got some new legislation coming in, so we'll have a very quick chat around that. And then I'll just finish up with you know, some things that are heading our way up on the back of an Amos review that was conducted last year. So I'll just bring you up to speed again briefly around some of the things that's potentially happening there. So let's get into it. So obviously the big thing this year has been COVID-19. So fair to say that initially, you know, there was quite a lot of confusion around, you know, what does all this mean in terms of exports and export of meat specifically. I guess the initial thing that we saw was that some countries and some customers were asking us to provide sort of, you know, certificate endorsements that the meat and the meat products that we're exporting weren't going to be a COVID risk, or they were coming from some sort of system that was going to be able to assure that you know, the virus wasn't going to travel with the meat. I guess we've sort of at that stage provided some fairly straightforward information for our industry to digest, and then sort of share that with their customers if they were becoming, you know, sort of increasingly you know, requesting, you know, sort of information and guarantees. So I guess fundamentally our position has been consistent with the international position on this, and that's COVID-19 is unlikely and incredibly unlikely to be a source of transmission of the virus, and to date there really hasn't been any you know, COVID cases around the world linked to, you know, certainly not linked to meat or food, you know. And while theoretically, my understanding is the virus theoretically can survive on surfaces for a short period of time, or on packaging for a short period of time, that hasn't we haven't seen you know, any concerns around COVID, the virus itself being transmitted through food. But we have, you know, sometimes, you know, customers and overseas countries, you know, sort of, you know, want more. They do want some sort of assurance, despite the science that sits behind that. So there are some letters, you know, facilitation letters available on our MyCore, and there's some statements there that we can use. But fundamentally, you know, our view is that, you know, consistent with, you know, the food experts such as FSANZ and the European Food Safety Agency and the Food and Agricultural Office, you know, these sort of, you know, international organisations. Our view is consistent with theirs, that we don't believe that that's really an issue to be worried about. What we have seen, I guess, with the basically the lack of international sort of, you know, air travel, and you know, with our air freight consignments, you know, typically the health certificate will travel with the consignment, and or you know, travel separately via courier, and the lack of those sort of services being available, we've had to, you know, initially we had to do some quick negotiation with our importing countries to allow, you know, various forms of copies of health certificates, or you know, facsimiles of certificates, scanned sort of documents to be provided initially to facilitate that import clearance, you know, with the understanding that the original certificates would be provided as soon as they came out. And what we have been doing, and I'm sure that you would have seen quite a few of these, we've been issuing sort of market access advices. They're issued by our export standards branch in Canberra. What they've been doing is sort of providing, you know, sort of regular updates about certain markets and what's the current state of play in terms of certification and their acceptance of you know, non-original documents. So I would encourage you to keep looking out for those market access advices. They do seem to be coming out fairly regularly around this subject. And probably important to note that these arrangements that we've had in place for some of these, sort of alternate certification arrangements, I guess, in providing certification, they are temporary. They're certainly, all the countries are telling us, look, we're happy to do this now, but once COVID resolves, whenever that may be, and it becomes a little bit easier to get original certificates over to them, then these arrangements will be taken away from us. So they are temporary. What it has enabled us to do is, a few of you would probably be aware that we do have what we call an e-cert, which is our electronic certification, which basically effectively replaces paper certificates. And we've got quite a few countries that accept electronic certificates right now, but still got quite a few countries that don't. They still want the old manual certificate that's got the blue ink signature on it from a government officer. But I guess this COVID situation has opened the door a little bit with a few markets, and Philippines being one of those. And there was an early acceptance from the Philippines around looking at eCert more closely. I think in the past we'd approached them and they sort of said, oh, it looks good, but we're not quite ready for that. But I think COVID has certainly facilitated those discussions, and we're looking to implement that as a permanent sort of structure for the Philippines. And then we've got a few other markets that we're working with around that as well. So that's the certification. I guess one of the more recent things that's happened in terms of markets and looking for assurances is the China situation. So a few weeks ago now, they had a little bit of a spike in their Beijing, sort of a market area in Beijing. And there was suggestions, I think the story goes that they might have found COVID virus on a cutting board or something that was used for fish, and in this wet market, and this market was getting a lot of imported sort of seafood, and some of that fish came from Australia. And so there was a level of public concern that possibly COVID was being brought into Beijing through the imported foods. And I think the Chinese sort of government's response to that was to ask their direct their importers and I guess through the importers to the exporters to start providing letters of guarantee that the products that they were importing had been produced obviously in Australia, in compliance with not only Chinese sort of requirements around food safety, but also around international sort of guidance documents from our World Health Organization, and again the Food and Agricultural Office, some of their guidance around how we can sort of manage the COVID risk in food safety in our food businesses. So fair to say that caused a little bit of concern within our sort of export sort of meat sort of area. So what we've done as a department is we've engaged China sort of fairly directly on that, and to try and understand what exactly it is they're after. And again, referring them back to the international sort of position, and that meat exports and food exports are incredibly low risk, and an unlikely sort of transmission sort of pathway for the virus. Fair to say that's probably when you're dealing with China, it's always quite challenging, and they've sort of not just treated Australia with these types of risks, but all around the world, and you would be aware that there's quite a number of meat establishments around the world that have had issues with COVID sort of positives in their workforce, and China have sort of stopped sort of taking meat from those establishments. So it's been quite challenging, but I guess what we're trying to do is minimise disruption to you guys as much as we possibly can, and the advice that we provided that to try and push back as much as you can around these letters of guarantee, but appreciate that can be quite challenging at times as well. What actually China has then sort of further gone from that is they've actually started conducting some remote auditing of overseas food businesses, and they've sort of been going around the world, various countries, and doing these sort of remote video conferencing sort of audits I guess looking for demonstrations of COVID controls in real time at food businesses that are sending the product. And actually, interestingly, just prior to this meeting, I was in a Skype meeting observing the Chinese and Australian officials having a meeting around the COVID controls at a seafood establishment here in Australia. So unfortunately, though, the technical sort of side let us down, and right before I joined this webinar, the connection to China was lost, and so I've left them to try and re-establish that connection. But certainly, I think China's expectation was that at some point there would be remote auditing, video conferencing, live footage provided of a seafood establishment in Australia. Initially, there was talk that China were keen to do the same sort of activity for a meat establishment. That seems to have dropped off a little bit. So it may not be completely off the agenda, but it looks at this stage that China might just limit that sort of remote auditing to a seafood establishment. But watch this space. Watch this space. So that's China. What else has happened because of COVID? Well, as you know, Australia, we get lots of overseas audits. Some are routine sort of systems audits, and looking to verify that the Australian export meat system continues to be what our trading partners think it is. And some of those audits are specific establishment listing audits, where establishments are seeking to gain access to a certain overseas market. Fairly obvious to say that with the restrictions on sort of international travel, and if anyone was to travel to Australia, the need to quarantine for 14 days, that has effectively across the board led to all of our countries that do come to Australia and conduct audits, such as Malaysia and Indonesia and the USA, postponing their audits. So we were, prior to COVID sort of hitting us in March, we were due to, I think we're only a couple of weeks away from a Malaysian sort of listing audit and a review audit. So that's been sort of postponed. Obviously, Indonesia were going to come and look at some new listings. I think some tier 1 establishments were seeking listing, and I think we were still working through some rendering sort of meat and bone meal sort of issues with Indonesia. So that's been put on hold. And the US had indicated, I think back in possibly late last year, maybe early this year, that they were looking to conduct their next sort of regular systems audit of Australia in around sort of July, August, and clearly that's not going to happen. One thing that we are trying to work with as best we possibly can is sort of sometimes establishments, when you're seeking a new listing, it might be Malaysia, or it might be Singapore, or whatever market. There will be an application that has to be done, and then there has to be sort of an on-site audit. So we are sort of continuing to engage with those markets and trying to get to a point where possibly I think we've asked a couple of countries whether or not they would be prepared to provide some sort of provisional listing for establishments, and then follow it up with an on-site audit if they feel that was necessary down the track, but enable that establishment to start accessing that market, based on what the Department of Agriculture, Water and Environment were recommending. So I don't think we've had a lot of success on that at this point in time, but we are still trying to do the best we can. One thing that has happened, I guess, with COVID is that there's been an example where, I guess through need of sourcing sort of protein and product, we've had one country, Singapore, relax a little bit of their requirements. So I know it's, in poultry for Singapore, and I'm not too sure you guys get much exposure to poultry, but we don't export a lot of poultry, but occasionally we do. And Singapore, when we export poultry to Singapore, there's actually a requirement that a department veterinary officer attends the poultry establishment and supervises the production run. So conducts some anti-mortem of the birds, and then supervises the production, and including the sort of the post-mortem inspection that's done by the company sort of employees. And that then sort of enables us to certify that the meat has met Singapore requirements. So they've had that existing requirement for a long time, but they came to us at I guess not long after COVID broke, and said, look, we're really pretty desperate for some poultry. You know, our suppliers have sort of, you know, it's all sort of fallen apart a little bit, and we need to get some into our country, you know, reasonably soon. So they relaxed their requirement to have veterinary, you know, sort of officer presence for frozen poultry, not for chilled. They still need, for some reason, they still need a vet there for chilled, but I'm quite happy to take frozen poultry that had been, you know, provided it was produced in accordance with the Australian standard and in accordance with the approved arrangement. I'm quite happy to take that. So again, they've indicated to us this isn't something that they're looking to lock in stone forever and a day, and it's purely a temporary measure in response to some supply issues they've had. And I guess we anticipate that once those supply issues have been addressed, they'll notify us that veterinary officer presence is again required. Let's just keep moving on. So in terms of, you know, some of our sort of activity, the department's, you know, sort of regulatory activity, what we are doing is the inspection and verification activities, you know, from OPVs and FSMAs remain unchanged. So I guess initially, early on, you know, everyone's thought was around reducing, you know, exposure to viruses and reducing the amount of people that were necessary to be at the plant. Well, I mean, clearly, if we are to provide certification, we need to you know, have veterinary officers and you know, meat inspectors conducting their activities, their inspection and verification activities. If they weren't there doing that at the establishments, then the product being produced, we just would not be able to certify it. So that's pretty much remained unchanged. Although we have, you know, clearly, you know, advised all of our staff and instructed all of our staff that, you know, during these, you know, verification sort of inspection activities, to maintain the social distancing. And what I guess what we have also been trying to do as best as we possibly can is to limit the number of, you know, sort of people that have to travel around, you know, either you know, within states or you know, within cross-state borders to you know, provide backfill relief. So I know that the service delivery component of our business, they've been, you know, really trying their best to ensure that, you know, that the people that are turning up at your establishments are pretty much the same people every day. That's not always achievable because, you know, people have time off and for various reasons they have to take leave, and we have to backfill. So occasionally we do need to move them around. So, but we have been trying to do the best we possibly can. On the area technical manager front, and I assume you've been seeing a little bit of this at your establishments. One of the things that we've instructed all of our ATMs to do is to conduct their supervisory visits of the on-plant vet remotely. So traditionally, what we would do, the ATM would visit the site and spend, you know, 4 or 5 hours with the vet and just verifying that the on-plant vet was implementing the systems and conducting the activities we wanted them to do. So we very early on decided that wasn't a task that you needed to do face to face. It could be done remotely. So, excuse me, the ATMs have been doing that remotely, you know, using, you know, technologies such as FaceTime and Skype, and we've just recently had Microsoft Teams added to our suite of software. So, so we've been doing that. We are also right early on. We were looking, thinking, you know, I guess like everyone was thinking at the time, and you never say never, because we're seeing I guess an explosion of cases in Victoria again, which is where I'm based. But so we were anticipating that, you know, based on, you know, what the scientists were telling us, that potentially, you know, sort of 30 to 40% of our workforce would be unable to attend due to contracting COVID. So we put in some contingency plans to increase our resource capacity. You know, given that we're in the business of providing veterinary, you know, sort of inspection, we needed to be able to continue to provide that service to enable, you know, you guys to operate and, you know, provide, you know, meat for export. So we've undertaken some fairly sort of, you know, rigorous fast track sort of training of a whole bunch of new veterinary officers and meat inspectors. We've sort of looked within the department and you know, people with veterinary degrees that have moved, who may have been an OPV in a former life, and moved into another area, and also meat inspectors. Some of our meat inspectors have done that, so we sort of tapped them on the shoulder and said, look, we want to retrain you just in case we need you down the track. So we did a bit of that, and we also looked externally, and we've got quite a number of new contractors going through their induction program at the moment. We've reduced the length of that induction program to sort of fast track that and then enable sort of a quick turnaround of vets if we need them, and meat inspectors. So we've sort of limited their training to one species. So I think our usual training program is about 12 weeks, and we've sort of cut that down to 6. So as it's turned out though, we actually haven't really needed to tap into that extra resource and that backup pool. But like I said, you never say never, and hopefully we're going to get on top of this in Victoria. But in case it does start having an impact on our ability to provide service, we're pretty confident we've got a fair capacity in the background waiting to be mobilised. So that will be good. Now, what else can I tell you? I know there's some questions there. I might just push on before I just get to those. In terms of our auditing, this was probably a little bit controversial to start with. Probably fair to say the industry position was, to request audits to be all done remotely or suspended or postponed. We formed the view that these audits were necessary to be conducted, and we certainly weren't going to postpone them. We're going to continue on because we thought that they were necessary to underpin our confidence to be able to provide certification. But clearly we needed to modify how we did that for various reasons, mostly around exposure of our staff to risks, and obviously exposure of abattoir staff to risks as well. So what we have done with people calling me from Canberra. So what we have done with our systems audits, our 6 monthly sort of MSAP audits that we do, which are traditionally sort of 2 ATMs, one from interstate and one local for 2.5 days. What we've done is we've modified that. So we're still doing 2.5 days of auditing, but we'll only have one ATM on site, one auditor on site physically there. And that ATM will be the local ATM, so they haven't travelled. They haven't needed to travel to without interstate to get to the establishment. And then what we've done is the other ATM, who is usually based interstate, will be utilising them in remote auditing capacity. And I think I would say thank you to establishments that have facilitated that. I think initially when we were doing this, our IT infrastructure was really not sort of geared up to do that very well. So we've sort of utilised some establishments, sort of ITs that were a little bit more advanced than ours. Utilising sort of technology such as Microsoft Teams to enable us to have sort of meaningful, exchange from a remote auditor and establishment sort of QA teams and provision of records and all that sort of stuff. So I think the feedback that I get when I talk to our auditors and the establishments that sort of get involved in this is it seems to work okay. It seems to be effective. I actually did a little bit of a validation on that just to make sure that remote auditing was effective, and that validation sort of came out that said, yep, if there's things there to find, you can still find them through remote auditing. So we're all fairly sort of comfortable that we haven't watered down the effectiveness of our audits by doing remote. And I guess looking forward to the future, COVID will eventually go away. But obviously there's lots of learnings around how we can do our business and efficient ways to do business, and maybe down the track, some of these learnings that we're taking now out of COVID are something that we embed into our regulatory system on a more permanent basis going forward. So that's all good. So just to continue on with the COVID impacts. What we did see initially also was a need for you guys to be able to implement social distancing as much as you possibly can, and I appreciate that was quite challenging in processing areas where people were needed to work sort of in fairly close proximity to each other. It's just the nature of processing. Certainly in boning rooms, like my observations were that it's quite challenging to sort of have really good, effective social distancing in boning rooms, just by pure nature of how they're designed. But certainly there were things that could be done, in terms of moving people in and out of production areas and amenities and lunchrooms, and we got quite a few requests to set up temporary lunchrooms, sort of seeing marquees and sort of lunchrooms that used to be locker rooms and all that sort of stuff. So I guess we just had to have a little bit of governance around that and make sure it wasn't going to cause any sort of issues, and I think we're all fairly comfortable that it doesn't, provided we maintain these areas in a clean state. So we had a few sort of approved arrangement changes that we sort of fast tracked to allow that to happen. I guess the one of the other sort of things around COVID, and you guys would probably know this more than me, but it really has impacted on quite a number of export establishments. There's certain businesses have basically their customers have shut up shop. Obviously with lockdowns around the world, and quite a number of sort of restaurants and cafes and food service sort of businesses basically ceasing. The demand for Australian meat that was going into those sectors is literally dried up overnight, so that's become quite challenging for some of our businesses. And we've had a number of requests from establishments to either become deregistered because there's no longer an export market there for them, or to basically suspend their export registration and until this flows over. Unfortunately for us, in our legislation, the export meat legislation doesn't actually have provision for any sort of voluntary sort of suspension. You either keep going or you become deregistered. So what we have done is we've allowed establishments to close, but we've had to maintain them paying registration fees. We've had to maintain the registration, so they've had to continue to pay their registration fees. So it has had an impact, and we've had a one establishment that was tier two abattoir with a vet and meat inspector on site. Because of COVID and the lack of activity internationally, they've had to revert back to tier one. So we facilitated that as well. So there are some, obviously some serious business impacts, around the traps. Okay, so I'm just going to try as much as I possibly can to navigate to these questions. Just bear with me while I try to figure out how I do that. I might just have to escape out of here so I can get my mouse back up. So James Raff has asked regards to ATM monthly reviews, any update on remote auditing at plant levels? No, James, not at monthlies. We did do a little bit of a trial about doing all of our monthly audits remotely. And we had a few auditors do that. That was driven, probably more driven by the fact that a number of our auditors were above 70 years of age and we couldn't utilise them anymore. It was too high of a risk. So it was more of a workforce capacity thing for us. So we trialled it. It seemed to work okay, but we decided that while we were still able to travel and take the advice of the Department of Health, then we would continue to do that. So that's kind of where that ended up. So we are still doing on-site monthly audits, and I've actually been doing a few of those around Victoria due to one of our auditors being in that sort of that age category where we really don't want them going out and about. I've got another question here. Looking at documented COVID safety plans. Look, I mean, so the question is, AMT have suggested we should look at having a documented COVID-19 safety plan for the business. We've implemented appropriate measures. However, is this something that the Department is encouraging or expecting? It's certainly not something that we're expecting. I don't know about encouraging. I would encourage everyone to try and develop plans to keep everyone safe. But from a regulatory point of view, this is probably an important point to make. The Department of Agriculture, Water and Environment are not fundamentally involved in the regulation of COVID, plans at establishments and social distancing. It's outside the scope of our regulation. The only time we would touch on it would be, that personal hygiene practices need to be appropriate to ensure that meat products aren't contaminated. So just at that sort of that basic personal hygiene level, and fundamentally, if people are ill, they should not be handling meat and should not be sort of turning up to work. But outside of that, we are not the regulatory agency that's involved in monitoring social distancing procedures or COVID sort of plans or anything like that. And I know with some of the meat establishments that have been involved in positive cases, the regulatory agencies involved in discussions with where to from here. And I think whilst we're involved, it's more that the Department of Human Services and Department of Health type sort of people who get involved and start having discussions with establishments and people like WorkSafe and come and reviewing practices and procedures at sort of abattoirs about what's appropriate. So no, it's not something that that we're doing. Oh, sorry, that was an ATM that suggested that. Well, look, I mean, like I said, I mean, I'd encourage everyone to have some sort of plan about keeping people safe. But from a regulatory department point of view, yeah, it's not something that we're involved in. Okay, so that's COVID. So fair bit going on, and hopefully we're going to be able to get through this next sort of Victorian sort of hurdle quickly as we possibly can, and everyone's going to remain safe. Now, just some meat notices. It's been a fairly quiet sort of year so far with meat notices. So we've had one around kangaroos and making sure that we're issuing incident reports where we're seeing gunshot wounds. So that was really just to remind our game establishments if that's what you're seeing, because all kangaroos are supposed to be sort of headshot from a humane sort of welfare point of view. And if we're seeing evidence that they're not, then we need to report that. So that was just to remind people of that. We also had our cotton trash notice. So farms. There are some farms that feed cotton trash coming out of that sort of that cotton industry, the gins and stuff coming feeding it, and they're allowed to. They can do that, but provided they observe relevant withholding periods and whatnot. But it seemed that there was some slippage of that, and maybe some of these animals were being sent to slaughter when possibly they shouldn't have been. So that notice was around providing guidance to abattoirs about what are some of the activities that we want to see, in terms of checking statuses, sort of cotton trash statuses and warnings sort of statuses, what we want you to do. Ideally, the farmers wouldn't be sending them in, but if they did, then we just need to provide some guidance about what to do. So that notice. And the other notice we issued was also just sort of around cadmium in livers and kidneys and the requirements there for exports. So what we had in place was a program that provided a couple of options if you wanted to export sort of livers and kidneys from various types of livestock. The first option was to make sure you source your animals from areas that we know presented limited risk in terms of cadmium residues in livers and kidneys. Second option was to conduct sort of production testing. So during the day, you would sample various lots, and on the basis of the results, if cadmium wasn't an issue, then that day's production was good to go for an export point of view. And the third option was to come up with an alternative procedure and maybe do some sort of consignment-based testing. So this notice, though, basically removed that second option. So that second option of production lot testing was always there purely to gather data to enable our scientists in Canberra to analyse where the real sort of cadmium hotspots in Australia were, what regions, and try to provide a more detailed list of areas and regions that could be sort of documented in sourcing tables to enable establishments to source livestock and be confident that the livers and kidneys weren't going to present a residue risk. So that was the purpose of that notice. So they're all out there at the moment, but like I said, it's been fairly quiet on the notice front. Although I will say, I'll give you a little bit of a sort of a hot off the press sort of thing. There will be a notice coming out in the next couple of months around a refrigeration index. the refrigeration index, you know, is currently in legislation, and it's it's a measure of the effectiveness of refrigeration applied to meat and carcasses to control, you know, sort of bacterial growth. So it's been around since 2005, and what we've seen, I guess, is, you know, the industry and us over the last couple of years is a little bit of a lack of understanding about exactly how we want that refrigeration index system to be managed on plant, mostly around sort of how often do I actually have to do it, how often do I have to data log, you know, sort of my cartons or my carcasses, how often do I have to validate that. So industry and some people in the department, you know, for the last sort of, I don't know, 6 to 12 months have you know, come up with a new guideline for refrigeration index. So it's been through sort of various processes, and it's been sort of considered to be acceptable. So what we're going to do is we're going to eventually publish that. That'll go up onto ELMA, and I'll write a meet notice just introducing that. So fundamentally, it'll provide you guys with a little bit more clarity around exactly how we want the RI to be applied. And effectively, it'll be an annual validation of your various processes you guys. So hopefully, you know, the next time the ATM comes in to do an audit and asks you about RI, you'll have a little bit more sort of understanding about what to expect and what we expect of you guys in your approved arrangements to manage RI. So that'll be probably the next meet notice that we see. Okay. Move on to post-mortem inspection and disposition updates. So over the last couple of years, there's been quite a bit of work driven by industry-funded research projects looking at various post-mortem inspection procedures and whether or not they're relevant, and also some dispositions. You know, when we find pathology and the dispositions we apply, are they relevant from a food safety point of view? So the research has been fundamentally trying to capture this principle of risk that you know, we need to make. You know, we need to have inspection procedures and dispositions that are actually based in risk. That we make sure that we're only doing things that are necessary, and if we need to condemn something, we're only condemning something that's actually a food safety risk. So all of that research has culminated in lots of various sort of, you know, papers being written and then presented to, you know, regulatory authorities, including us, and, you know, there's been changes implemented already in the domestic sector around, you know, changed inspection procedures and some changed dispositions. And I think, you know, what this slide's telling me is there's, you know, about 14 different, you know, changes to inspection procedures and 3 changes to dispositions. So so that's sort of got ahead of steam, and it's now being implemented in the domestic sector. Okay, so I think New South Wales was the first state to go earlier this year, and I think all the other states are on board now. So you're probably hearing in the domestic sector that they're undertaking these revised you know, procedures. Unfortunately, we've got a couple of impediments in the export space, one of which is the legislation actually requires us to comply literally with the current Australian standard. So we've got to get over that hurdle. So we're looking at, well, what are our options in terms of amending the standard? You know, how do we sort of, you know, work through that issue to incorporate these changes, but still enable us to comply with our own legislation? And I guess one other option is that we change the legislation. So we're working with that at the moment. It probably gets a little bit, it's been a little bit sort of tricky to navigate through that. It's taking probably a little bit longer than what we'd hoped. And I guess COVID's hit us, so a lot of that work has sort of, you know, stopped a little bit. But hopefully, you know, sooner rather than later, we'll be able to implement these in you know, sort of export. We will have to undertake some sort of, you know, negotiation with overseas trading partners, make sure that they're okay with what we're doing. But then once we do that, then it'll be all systems go. So we just need to keep waiting for that one. Some legislation, you know, so we actually are changing legislation, but this wasn't driven by the post-mortem. It was something that we're going to do anyway. You know, all legislation has a sunset clause, so you have to review it and you have to, you know, update it. So we're doing that now with our export legislation for all of our commodities. So we've already, you know, published the, you know, new Export Control Act's been through Parliament. That's now law. That'll come into play, I think it's the 28th of March 2021, so next year. And what that legislation effectively does is just consolidate a whole number of other pieces of legislation. I think from memory it was 40 pieces of legislation are now being sort of put into the Export Control Act. So it was really just to streamline all of that and make it a little bit easier. So what we're currently working on is looking at what we're calling the export meat rules. Now these rules are going to have all of the sort of the detail of what you can and can't do in export meat, very similar to what you've got now in your current legislation, your meat products legislation. So that's coming our way. We've I guess we published a couple of drafts, and eventually people started to read it. And there were some things in there that sort of just didn't quite make a lot of sense, and some terminology was new, and we needed to engage industry and try and work through those issues. So we've had a series of workshops with some industry representatives. I think we've taken on board all the feedback, and we're currently in the process of revising the rules, and they'll go back out for public consultation. I think it's in August. I think that's the plan, but there'll be more consultation, more opportunity to understand that. Effectively, not a lot changes, to be honest. I've sort of read these rules a bit, and it's very, very similar, if not exactly the same as what we currently deal with, and that was always the intent. There are a couple of little nuances though that on first read you think, oh, hang on, what's all this about? But once you sort of get into it and you understand the structure of it and how it all sort of links together, then it becomes fairly obvious that not a lot's changed. So you don't sit there worrying too much about that. There won't be mad rush to get you to change approved arrangements and all that sort of stuff in preparation. But there might be a couple of things we just need to tinker with, but there'll be more information about that in the second half of this year. I think we've sort of talked about a bit of that. So our workshops. Just to finish up a little bit of Amos review. So there was a review into Amos. So Amos is what we call the meat inspection system that we've got. And when we talk to overseas trading partners, we always use the term Amos. So basically, it's everything we do. It's all of our inspections, our verifications, approved arrangements, testing, you name it, certifications. That's all Amos. We've had that in place in its current form since about 2011. There was always a commitment to review that regularly. There was a review done, I think it was last year, by a group called Palladium. I think AMPC and AMIC were involved in funding a lot of that. So that review sort of took place, and the recommendations of that review were published late last year. So they're publicly available. I'm not going to go through what they were now. Broadly, the review found that the system seems to work. It does a pretty good job. Meat flows out of Australia, and we're certifying it, and market access is being maintained. There were a few recommendations though about how we can make this system better. How can we make it more, I guess, competitive? Given that it's becoming increasingly difficult to sell meat overseas. So how do we keep Australian sort of meat sectors, competitive? So some of those recommendations were fairly big ticket sort of items, and so just very, very recently, I'm not too sure how widely this has been sort of communicated by AMIC, but there has, I think it was a couple of weeks ago, there was a ministerial roundtable. So our minister, Minister Littleproud, met with senior industry figures and have started the conversation around where to from here in terms of some of the things that we as regulators would like to do and as industry would like to do to ensure that Amos continues to be world's best practice and relevant and positioning the Australian sort of meat industry, export meat industry in the best possible position to maintain market access and maintain sort of competitive sort of the competitiveness in the marketplace. So that's happening. It's very early days. So I would suggest if you're keen to understand more about that, probably at this stage have a chat to your AMIC representative. I think there'll be a little bit of planning around that, and then the minister will probably want to be making some announcements down the track. But again, it's very early days. One last thing that I'll just touch on, just cost recovery. So you'd be aware clearly that the department are looking to change the fee structure, and I'll be honest, to increase the amount of money that we need to to recover from industry to cover our costs. So that's been a bit of an ongoing, process with, with regulatory impact statements and consultation periods, and various options being put to industry about what's the best, sort of cost recovery model. Is it registration charges? Is it throughput charges? Is it sort of fee for service? How does it all work? So that's been sort of ongoing consultations. Unfortunately, COVID seems to have just put a little bit of a stop in that. So we'll just have to just again be patient around that. But effectively, the government will make a decision on that at some point in the future. And that's it. That's me. It's now 3:53. That went way longer than I thought it would. No more questions coming through. So Amanda, I think we might be all good.
Fantastic, thanks, Jason. Just as we're wrapping up, if anyone does have any last-minute questions, feel free to type them in, and we'll hand them over to Jason. So, thank you all for attending today's webinar, and a big thank you to Jason for taking the time out of his very busy schedule to update the industry. I've found the presentation to be very informative. Thanks, Jason. With some really good insights around COVID and also some of the business decisions establishments are currently making. Looking forward to seeing the refrigeration index and the changes there, and hopefully might be able to give an update to the processes either in person or via a webinar in the future. So once that sort of...
Yeah, I think that's an excellent idea, actually. Let's do that. Let's, when that refrigeration index gets up and going, let's have another one of these.
Yeah, no, that would be great. We're definitely keen to organise that with you. So just a reminder for everyone, the webinar has been recorded. So I know a few people had to leave and then sort of come back. So if you have missed any, you can go onto the AMPC YouTube channel, and there's a playlist there with all our webinars. So it will be updated and on there by tomorrow morning. Our next webinar is next Thursday, and it's actually going to be on a sustainable packaging and the roadmap for 2025. So Jason, we've just had one last question come in. Refrigeration index changes. Will this be included in the micro manual?
No, it's going to be a separate standalone guideline, okay? Because it's got a fair bit of information to impart, the science of RI and the theory of it and how we actually want you to do it. So, and what we're more than likely going to do currently in that micro manual, there's a whole bunch of information around product dispositions that when we get sort of breakdowns of refrigeration, we're actually going to take that out of that micro manual, because the RI guideline that's been developed basically has all of that stuff. We thought it was more appropriate to have that information in the RI guideline so effectively it becomes a bit of your one-stop shop, because we know that RIs are commonly used to make assessments of product when we have breakdowns. So yeah, it won't be in the micro manual.
Great, thanks for answering that question. So we've had no more questions come through. So thank you once again, Jason, for your time, and we'll be in touch for a future webinar. And it sounds like we'll be able to do one around refrigeration index. So thanks everyone for attending, and we look forward to having you on some of our webinars in the future.